Thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Anna Herforth. I am co-founder and co-director of the Ag-to-Newt community of practice. This community has been, we started in 2010 as a group to join together diverse communities around how can agriculture and food systems improve nutrition. And for those of you who have been involved for a long time, you know that previously we used to do lots of webinars in Ag-to-Newt. As the webinar space became more saturated over time, especially as the world went more online during the pandemic, the number of webinars we've done has gone down to those that are really requested, and we're always willing to host and co-host webinars of interest to the community requested by members. And so that's how this webinar arose in collaboration co-hosted by the Alliance of Bioversity and CIAT, the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. These are CGR organizations, and really happy to be hosting with the Alliance this event on participatory methods to document traditional and indigenous peoples' food systems and traditional knowledge to promote healthy and sustainable diets. This has been a theme of an area of interest and work in linking food systems to nutrition that I think has been pretty consistent within the community. It's great to be able to highlight these aspects around traditional food systems and traditional knowledge in this webinar today. So in general, in Ag-to-Newt, we also like to engage as a community on resources of interest linking agriculture and nutrition. So if you're not already a member, you can join at agtonewt.org. And I will first pass it over to Cecilia Gonzalez, also co-leader of the Ag-to-Newt community of practice, to give some words of introduction.
Thanks, Anna. So in the welcome and instructions, I would like to let you know that this webinar will be recorded. If you would like to turn on closed captions, you can find them in your menu. And also for questions, please write them in the Q&A box, and we will be going through those questions and answering them live as possible. And also bring them up after the different speaker presentations, and at the end we will have a session for Q&A. During the Q&A session, we will ask a couple of people if they can raise their hand so to verbalize your question. So I will be, one of us will unmute if you have your hand raised and request that you ask your question briefly, concisely, and yeah. Without further ado, I'll pass it to Gina Kennedy for speaker introductions.
Thank you so much, Anna and Cecilia. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody joining us for the first in this webinar series, a three-part series on food and knowledge systems of Indigenous peoples to advance healthy and sustainable diets. So let me just start by saying that this series is brought to you by two task forces of the International Union of Nutritional Sciences, the IUNS. So it's brought to you by the Task Force on Traditional and Indigenous Food Systems and Nutrition and the Task Force on Sustainable Diets. So thank you to the two task forces for coming together for this three-part series. And also thanks to the Ag-to-Newt platform for hosting this and spreading the word via their very wide network. This series is going to be spread across May and June. The second in the series will probably be in early June, and then the final of the three parts will be later in June, toward the end of June. So please just stay tuned for those updates. It will all be hosted by Ag-to-Newt, so you will get the announcement on the Ag-to-Newt platform. I just want to go through the objectives of the series, which are to strengthen the narrative across agriculture, food systems, and nutrition communities on how evidence on food system and diets of Indigenous and traditional communities should be acquired, disseminated, and used. Secondly, to provide examples and discuss how to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into the evidence base while also respecting Indigenous data sovereignty. And this is the entire series, we're also going to be considering how to navigate diverse viewpoints and approaches to gathering knowledge, and kind of looking at different approaches such as holistic or reductionist approaches and innovations versus traditions. And then a final objective of the two task forces getting together to prepare this series is to stimulate additional forms of knowledge dissemination and engage a wider community of practice, such as yourselves, who are interested in this topic. So the three-part series includes today's webinar, which is on methods. And this webinar on methods is going to provide an overview of past and present participatory community-based methods that have been used to collect data and community knowledge related to traditional and Indigenous foods. The second part, which will be in early June, is on perspectives and approaches. And the second webinar will discuss diverse approaches and perspectives that accompany research methods and build the scientific evidence. It will cover perspectives from various contexts and ways of connectivity and relationships between people and nature. And then the third part is going to be on evidence-based policy mechanisms for food security and nutrition, exploring aspects of health, agriculture, and environment in an integrated way to advance policy development, particularly linked to achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and other global policy goals. So the topics in the third webinar will be on the politics of evidence, again, holistic and reductionist approaches, different ways of generating knowledge and evidence and co-creating knowledge and evidence, and rethinking hierarchies of evidence for policy development. So for today's first webinar in this series, I'll be your facilitator, and my name is Gina Kennedy. I'm a principal scientist with the Alliance of Bioversity and CIAT, who's behind the scenes running the technical platform for us today on Zoom. I'm also a director of research, translation, and impact for the Periodic Table of Food Initiative. And finally, I'm the chair of one of the hosts of this series on the task force, the IUNS Task Force on Traditional and Indigenous Food Systems and Nutrition. So we are going to hear from each of our four speakers. And after each speaker, there'll be a few minutes for you to answer ask any questions you have for that particular speaker on what they talked about and the methods that they're presenting. And then at the end of all four speakers, we'll have a time for a facilitated discussion. So our first speaker is Dr. Harriet Kuhnlein. It's just my great honor and privilege to have Harriet with us today to speak. She's known by so many of us as, a leader and a mentor and an absolutely dedicated colleague. Harriet is the founding director for the Center for Indigenous Peoples Nutrition and Environment, or CINE, and also a professor emerita at the School of Dietetics and Human Nutrition at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. Harriet continues to dedicate her time, skills, and vast expertise to influence local, national, and international policies that respect and protect Indigenous peoples' land and food resources. She really is the first perfect speaker for this first of our webinar series on methods. 20 years ago, Harriet and colleagues gathered together to co-create a set of research methods to document with Indigenous communities their food systems. That book was published in 2006, and it's available. I'm sure Harriet will link to it. If not, we can give you the link. And these efforts have resulted in numerous peer-reviewed publications, as well as this renowned three-part book series on Indigenous peoples' food systems. So her groundbreaking work really in this field continues to inspire and incentivize many others. It's my great pleasure to pass the floor to you, Harriet, to talk about methods to document food systems of Indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Gina. I'm really happy to be here this morning. And my objective is to share some highlights from the project that was conducted by CINE and the FAO, and as part of the foundation for the IUNS Task Force on research over several years. Well, I'm not advancing my slides for some reason. Franco, can you help me? Oh, there we
Yes,
go.
yes, okay.
So I am privileged to live and work in the home territories of the Coast Salish and Haudenosaunee peoples. And I acknowledge with respect the CINE Governing Board. You see some of them here on the left. The Governing Board of Indigenous leaders who guided the development of CINE for the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. So my objective really is to highlight some of the methods that were created during the early 90s. So an important background was the successful work that CINE did with Indigenous peoples in the Arctic that was completed in the year 2000. So the research was with 44 communities, 16 of them Dene in red, the Yukon First Nations in white, and the Inuit in yellow. So the objective of this large project was to show the nutritional and cultural benefits in contrast to the organochlorine and heavy metal risks for these communities in the north, and this has been a continuing concern. So I want to emphasize straight away that it is an absolute requirement for Indigenous leaders to assist involvement and commitment for participation with Indigenous communities. So this graphic shows you some of the ways we proceeded with data analysis. In addition to seasonal traditional food species frequency data, we collected dietary data with repeat recalls and basically divided the data into these two categories, the traditional food and market food. So as you can appreciate, for any individual and any community average, there was a balance, primarily an overbalance of market food, with only about 4 to 40% of dietary energy coming from traditional food. So that's percent of energy. You could also do the analysis for any of the nutrients. I'm going to skip this slide. So in any amount, nutrients significantly were higher on days with traditional food, consistently for all of the three cultural categories. So even with very small portions of traditional food, in contrast to days containing only purchased food, all these nutrients were significantly higher for the three cultural groups. And you can see the citation there at the bottom of your screen, 2004. So following this research, I received the invitation by the FAO Nutrition Division, thank you again, Barbara, for a sabbatical in 2001. And this was to develop methods useful for studying Indigenous peoples globally in a diversity of ecosystems. So the decision was to work with contacts from the FAO office in Bangkok. And here you see a couple of shots from that meeting with the participants there in the bottom. So they agreed that these 5 Indigenous peoples in Asia would create the balance of diversity of ecosystems for the methods development. So just a few pictures to show some of the lessons that we learned straight away. Just about getting to the grassroots, getting up close and personal to these food systems. So this is the Miao National minority in Sichuan, China. You see Li Dan there in the bottom from the Institute of Nutrition and Food Hygiene in Beijing. And he's demonstrating that here there was the need for a series of 4 translations for conversation and for data, from the Miao dialect to the major Miao language into the Mandarin and on to English. Another example, it's not always possible to have private interviews about food use when you're in an Indigenous community. Another example here from the Dalit in Zahirabad, close to Hyderabad in India. There are diverse sources of foods from ecosystems. You see top left, the woman is separating a pile of weeds that she harvested from her agricultural work and is separating them for meals. And there, as you see on the right, are diverse species of legumes, dozens and dozens of them that people eat annually. The Karen in Thailand show the importance of recognizing the spiritual significance of the natural food environment. The Karen held meetings in the Buddhist temple and hosted the team, shown here, with a feast prepared from forest foods. So Dr. Gopal with the Bihil Indigenous peoples in India showed the need to recognize and include all age and gender groups in the community in developing the research process. So the teams from these 5 centers met in 2003 to share and discuss results, and this took place in Bellagio, Italy. An important first step, I don't know if you can see that, an important first step was understanding the food lists. Each group completed a detailed food list, and the idea was to know if the species were yet identified or if they needed analysis for understanding the nutrient composition and doing the dietary evaluations. So it was important to carry through with each one of these foods. You can see the diversity in the needs for identification and analysis in the 5 areas. We also know for sure that there is a need for interdisciplinary specialists when you're conducting research with Indigenous peoples. This is a short list of the specialists that we engaged with, especially the Indigenous peoples' local leadership, zoologists, herbarian, anthropologists, food analysis, dietary data, database specialist, and of course, an environmental specialist who could help understand the amount of foods that are available. So 2 research guides were prepared, the decisions around this with our first meeting there in Bellagio, and both are on the CINE website, Indigenous Peoples and Participatory Health Research, and then the documentation guidelines. As I say, they're available both on the CINE website with these links. So at the same meeting, the decision was taken to continue the research with 12 case studies that were identified by FAO and CINE to proceed with the documentation of their food systems. 3 in Canada, 2 in Latin America, 1 in the Pacific, 4 in Asia, and 2 in Africa. But just quickly, some methodology, slides, qualitative data were taken, food identification, food availability, acceptability, and accessibility, quantitative data, both in the laboratory and with anthropometric measures or other biological measures. So I want to mention that it was important to have a data table with each food having a file that encapsulated the information, not only on the seasonality and the composition, but also importance in the community. So basically, there were 5 steps in this documentation protocol. Community consent and joint objectives being determined, and the agreement to have individual consents, however is preferred to do it, to proceed. A detailed food list by species. There may be sublists for parts of species or varieties, the preliminary dietary data to identify priorities, particularly for identification and composition studies, then the dietary evaluation and biological indicators and biomarkers of nutrition. So those 5 steps were considered in all 12 case studies. Came together again in Bellagio, and this took place in 2008. Everyone was very happy with the success of their projects, and they prepared for the first publication. But I want to be sure that you know that each of the case studies address the percent of energy from local traditional food and the number of species, which you can see here. The percent energy is quite diverse, as are the number of species, up to 300 species in some of the studies. So the first publication in 2009 is shown there, and then 9 of the case studies agreed to proceed further to create an intervention to improve well-being using their traditional food system. So this research proceeded in many different ways, depending on the case study, and it was completed and published in 2013. And when it was time for publication and release of that publication, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues invited us to New York to release the publication in a side event of the UNPFII. And here in the back, you show one of our Dene leaders holding up our publication. And next to him, Jan Fernandez de Laranoa, who you may have heard about, who has been very important in establishing the FAO Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food and Knowledge Systems. And that's been a very active group in the FAO. It's I'm showing it here as a World Food Day event where the FA Global Hub invited the Global Indigenous Youth Forum to Rome, youth being identified as being less than 30 years of age. And this was an amazing event held in 2 tents donated by the Sami reindeer herders. So I'm going to close there and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Harriet, for that amazing review of this foundational work, really, in participatory methods used to document Indigenous peoples' food systems. We will open the floor and take 1 or 2 questions. If the audience has any, please raise your hand and Cecilia will unmute you and you can ask your question. You see the hand raised, Cecilia?
Yep.
Please introduce yourself and your affiliation and then ask your question.
All right. My name is Dr. Omobalaji Adewi from Lautech, Ogbomoso. It's interesting to see the trajectory of indigenous food systems. And I just want to know, I saw that for Nigeria, Igbo community was studied, which is one of the community here in Nigeria. And it's interesting to see the numbers in terms of 220 species, 95% energy contribution. Should we have researchers who are interested, because there's actually a very large base of indigenous food database that is untapped across multicultural locations in Nigeria. So should we have researchers who is willing to probably take it up from the previous studies in terms of the Igbo location and maybe look at other locations? We have places up north as well that are prone to a lot of crisis, emergency settings. Are there rooms to explore some of these other locations with key learnings from what was studied in the Igbo settings? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Dr. Omobolachi. Harriet, what do you think?
Well, I'm all in favor of more research on Indigenous peoples' food systems. There's no reason not to do it everywhere. You just need to get organized, to get some funding, and decide the priorities depending on the cooperation of the communities.
Yeah, thanks, Harriet. I think we have time to take one more question. So please raise your hand if you have a question for Harriet. And please, if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the Q&A box, because we'll be collecting all your questions and thinking about them, ruminating on them. We will also have some time at the end, hopefully, for more audience participation. I just wanted to say that I've, been using Harriet's work for the 2 decades now. And one of the things that I think was just so interesting, and Harriet did show that in her slide, is this mixture that communities are using between their traditional foods and, quote, modern foods. And then I've spent a lot of time, for example, in the Pacific Islands, and we know that this reliance on imported foods, many of which are ultra processed foods. They contain so much fat and sugar and sodium, and it really changes people's dietary habits, and then often, to the detriment of their health and nutrition outcomes in terms of rising diet-related non-communicable disease. So just to emphasize Harriet's answer to you, Dr. Omobolaji, I think it's critical that we continue to look at actually what people are consuming and the quality of that diet. And I think it would be fascinating to have a study that compares what Harriet found, about 15, 20 years ago in terms of the percent traditional and modern, and look at what's happened now. Because as we know, there's just increasing pressure on land and communities to adopt different lifestyle patterns and different diets. And so I really second Harriet's encouragement to you to continue to do this type of research. Is there another hand quickly? Otherwise, we'll move to the next speaker.
No
Gina,
hand raised.
Okay.
there is a question in the Q&A from Nagla El Abadi, who thanked Dr. Kuhnlein for a wonderful presentation and asked for the food database. Was the information already available and just needed to be collated, or did you require lab analysis for some foods?
Well, I replied briefly in the Q&A, but it's obvious that it depends on the infrastructure. I mean, if InFoods has been active in the country, there is a lot of information there. A lot of traditional foods do find their way into national laboratories before they're being asked to do so. But it's inevitable that there are many species and varieties that are required for analysis, and that requires the infrastructure to go ahead and do the nutrient composition analysis. Is that sufficient?
Yeah, thank you, Harriet. And during after all 4 speakers have had a chance to give their presentations, I can also talk a little bit about the project called the Periodic Table of Food Initiative. I'll put it in the chat for everybody. And that is a project that Barbara Burlingame is very involved with us as a scientific advisor committee member, Barbara being one of the chairs of the Task Force on Sustainable Diets. So that is an initiative that is really trying to continue to promote documentation of the world's food biodiversity and the food composition that it contains. So let me go ahead and introduce our second speaker out of 4. Our second speaker is Dr. Rebecca Kanter. Dr. Kanter is with the Department of Nutrition and the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Chile in Santiago, Chile. She is also a member of the Task Force on Traditional and Indigenous Food Systems and Nutrition. And today she is going to speak to us about her work using participatory methods to identify perceived healthy and sustainable traditional culinary preparations in Chile. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Gina, for that introduction and for the invitation to participate in this great webinar. So for the purpose of my presentation, I'm going to use this definition of sustainable diet, whereby sustainable diets are those that have low environmental impacts, which contribute to food and nutrition security. And healthy life for present and future generations. I want to emphasize that sustainable diets not only are protective of biodiversity and ecosystems, but following this definition are also culturally acceptable, economically accessible, physically accessible, and nutritionally adequate. In Chile, the traditional Chilean diet that dates back centuries is based on many different cultures, including many First Nations to many European cultures, and consists of many fresh fruits and vegetables, fish, algae, and legumes. Some of these foods still form the basis of the Chilean diet, or what people consume here in Chile today, but are not as consumed as indicated, for example, in one of these first recipe books that's here on the left hand of this slide, which is a recipe book of exclusively vegetarian recipes, which surely reflected the local resources of the day when this recipe book was published. I'm going to present some methods and results from a research project that I conducted between 2017 and 2021 on healthy and sustainable diets for Chileans recovering traditional diets. And much of the methods for this project came from what Dr. Kuhnlein just presented on. And so it is very much the case that I don't think this project would have been possible without the previous work by Dr. Kuhnlein and her collaborators and colleagues all over the world. And so the general objective of this project was to produce insights about the sustainability of traditional Chilean diets, to identify culinary preparations for healthy diet interventions. And as it says here, the study design for this project was inspired by the toolkit that's presented here. And Gina also, I noticed, put this link in the chat. And it consisted of 4 data collection phases: key informant interviews, focus groups, individual interviews, and brief surveys. And as you'd see, if you look briefly in this toolkit document, it mainly focuses on how to collect data for edible plant species, but not necessarily per se cooked, prepared culinary dishes. And so the challenge I found was how to adapt what's in this toolkit for the purpose of the project I'll present to you. So this project was conducted in the north, center, and south of Chile. As you can see, Chile is a very long country, and we focused on the golden regions in the north and south, and then the blue region is the metropolitan region where Santiago is located, where I currently am at the University of Chile, and where over half of the Chilean population resides. This study included participants from 5 Asian ethnic groups and included people from First Nations communities and not. The numbers in this map reflect the numbers of activities that we did, which I'll go through in brief during the rest of this presentation. And you can also see in this map, we didn't just focus in on one county or municipality in each one of these regions in Chile, but we really tried to go to diverse areas in all 3 of these regions. There are less activities done in the north because that's when the pandemic happened and we had to stop doing field work. So the first phase of this project was to do key informant interviews. I've put in these slides examples of the forms we use just so that you can see at some later point in the top right-hand corner of these images, there's numbers that relate to forms, and those numbers link to the toolkit that Harriet presented on and that Gina put in the chat. And so you'll be able to see how they were adopted directly from that document. So we did key informant interviews whereby the key informants cooked a traditional dish or dishes of their choosing in their house. And we also asked them to free list from memory what they considered to be traditional culinary preparations. Then building off this knowledge with an understanding that people still remember have a memory of traditional culinary preparations, we conducted focus groups in all 3 of these regions in the country, whereby we also asked participants to free list what they would consider traditional culinary preparations, but consumed at specific meal times for breakfast, lunch, once or tea time, which is more common than dinner here in Chile, and then as well as dinner. And then for some of these culinary preparations within the focus group, ask them more specific questions about how they acquire the specific ingredients and about the seasonality of consumption, for example. Using this data based on the focus groups, and again, this follows the order of the methods in the toolkit from Harriet's team, we constructed a short list of culinary preparations that are still highly consumed and highly liked within these regions of the Chilean population. And using this short list of preparations, and I've included one short list from the metropolitan region here on the left-hand side, we made cards, which I'll show you what they look like, which have these preparations as photos on these cards. And then we asked different participants in 2 of these regions to sort these cards based on how they perceived these cards to fit the criteria for sustainable diets. So for example, we asked them, how would they consider combining these traditional culinary preparations to meet a meal within their household, for example? Which of these culinary preparations did they perceive to have a positive impact on the environment, or they perceive to have a negative impact on the environment? Which do they find to be physically accessible or not, economically accessible or not? And finally, what do they perceive to be nutritious or not? Based on the results from this card sort activity and interviews, we were able to do interventions at farmers markets, or what are called ferias libres here in Chile, which are all over the country, whereby we came up with informative recipe books and food samples of some of these recipes and did short surveys about whether they liked, which recipes they liked, and if they could perceive buying these foods as a prepared ready-made dish at some point in the future, which I will show you. So in sum, if you're interested in learning more, you can check out this publication, and I can also put a link to it in the chat. This goes in much more detail about these methods. In brief, again, these are all the activities that we did, and you can see through the color coding scheme how we did them in each one of the regions and the number of activities we did in each municipality or county. And then really in brief, across the regions, key informants cooked different recipes and free-listed 262 different unique culinary preparations. I've listed here some of the most liked foods by regions according to the focus group data, and you can see that some of the foods that are most liked are the same within the regions, such as eggs between the center and the north, or breads between the north center and the south. And Chile is a country that consumes a lot of bread and dough. To the left, you can see some of the photos of the recipes that people cooked during the interviews. Then from the card sort activities, these are the cards on the left-hand side. You can see that some of the cards are the same and some of them are not. The one card with text on the left-hand side says what is left over for lunch, and that is something that came up in the focus groups. That is not something that we suggested or anything like that, and that was really interesting, given that we didn't exactly address sustainability directly throughout this project. And just in brief from the card sort activity, I've put some of the results from the metropolitan region or a more urban central region on the top part of this table, and on the bottom is data from the south of Chile, where there's more diverse terrains and biodiversity. And the green just indicates the number of people out of 40 in each one of these regions that had sorted their card as being positively physically accessible, economically accessible as they perceive it to be, positively impacting the environment, again, as they perceive it to be, and finally, as they perceive it to be nutritionally adequate. So you can see in the central metropolitan region of Chile, there's more people that I identify having problems regarding economic access to beef, avocado, and seafood. Avocado in Chile is widely produced, but extremely expensive here for people to purchase it. It's about $6 for a kilo of avocados here, but yet people are still willing to purchase it and consume it, which we also found interesting in this work. And based on these results, we were able to come up with these informative recipe books that we designed through a multidisciplinary team. And the beginning of the recipe book explains why it's important to recover and promote our traditional diets, especially given that here in Chile, many foods have front of package warning labels. And the recipes in these recipe books, which are here, but I will also give you an online link, are almost all vegetarian. And again, this came up based on what is widely consumed and widely still liked in these areas, not because we were trying to promote necessarily plant-based diets. So it's really interesting to see how that reflects the traditional Chilean diet of past centuries. So when we did the interventions in farmers markets, we handed out these recipe books to anyone who wanted them, and we also gave out food samples of the recipes in the books. And on a subset of people, we conducted these short surveys to see if they like the recipes, if they know how to cook it, if they're willing to learn how to cook them, and if they're willing to buy them as a hypothetical ready-made meal. As you can see, for these results for the southern region of Chile, La Araucanía, most people really liked all the recipes except for these crepes, lumami. And lumami is also a traditional Chilean diet concept or food culture term, which stands for lunes, martes, or miércoles, or Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And the idea of lumami is to utilize what is left over during Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And so again, this also came up through the data that we collected. It wasn't something that we suggested, but it really ties into the concept of sustainable diets. And as you can see, it had the lowest percentage of people not liking the food, probably because they thought we were reutilizing ingredients during these interventions, which we were not doing. But you can see where something like this, even though it has a cultural basis in Chile in this context, also has a stigma potentially associated with it. There's low percentages of people saying that they know how to cook these recipes because a lot of these recipes are inspired by traditional recipes, but not exactly what we would call the specific traditional recipe of decades or centuries past. Finally, to conclude, we came up with an e-book or e-recipe book that you can download for free when the pandemic happened and we could no longer continue this work in the field. And as you can see here, we really conclude that geographic context is inextricably linked to food culture, and that affects how adults perceive sustainable diets. And traditional culinary preparations facilitate food culture and practice through the promotion of sustainable diets for both human and planetary health, especially in our current time of poly or concomitant crisis, where we still have a lot of social unrest happening in the world. The COVID-19 pandemic is still going on, and of course, ongoing climate change. Thank you so much to everyone who's worked on this, and again, to Gina and the IUNS for this invitation. And you can ask me questions. Sorry for going over a little bit of time, and you can also email me here. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Rebecca. That was just great, and a nice linkage between the work of our task force on traditional indigenous food systems and nutrition and the Sustainable Diets Task Force. There is one question for you already in the Q&A by Carol Zavaleta. And I'm just going to read it. And it says, "Great work, Rebecca. Thank you for sharing and your generosity. I see these methods can be replicated in Peru and Bolivia. And I like that you found the ones that are unique in Chile." So Carol's question is about the main outcome of the intervention and how was it evaluated?
So the main outcome, which I showed briefly, just so we don't have a lot of time, was to do those short surveys to really assess, do people like these recipes? Do they perceive themselves cooking them? And do they perceive potentially buying them as a ready-made meal, in terms of thinking, how can we consume more traditional foods in our diets? And as I showed in brief on that slide, most people really liked the recipes that we presented, both in the South and in the center of the country, in both regions. And both people were really willing to learn how to cook it and to cook it. Now, there was less people who said that they were willing to hypothetically buy it as a prepared dish, because they said, if we can learn how to cook it, and these are easy and affordable recipes, why do we need to potentially buy it as a ready-made dish? And that's how we evaluated the interventions that we did, just by assessing the survey data that we conducted in these regions. And the survey sample size was calculated to be representative of what we were doing.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. If anybody has any additional questions for Harriet and or Rebecca, please type them in the question and answer box, and we hopefully will have some time at the end to get to some more questions. I'm really pleased to introduce our next speaker, but just to say, he's based in Kenya, in Nairobi, and they're having so much rain these days. So he is experiencing a power outage. It's Patrick Mwandu. Patrick works for the Kenya Resource Center for Indigenous Knowledge, or KENRIC, at the National Museums of Kenya. And we are hoping that he's going to be able to speak to us, probably without his slides, on his most recent experiences with process, methods, and policy aspects to document and digitize Indigenous knowledge related to traditional and Indigenous foods in Kenya. So Patrick, I am crossing my fingers and hoping that you are able to have a stable phone connection and unmute yourself. Oh, even with the camera, it's better than expected. Okay, great, Patrick. Over to you. Thank you so much. You're on mute.
Even use my phone.
Okay, we got you now. Great, thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm Patrick Maundu. I work for the National Museums of Kenya, and as Gina said, Nairobi is experiencing an unusual weather, heavy rains, and the power has been knocked off by rains about two hours ago. But all the same, I'm going to speak orally without my presentation. I was hoping I would send it to her, but then the power went off before I did it. My presentation is about documentation work, Indigenous knowledge documentation work, and digitization in Kenya. As many of us know, traditional knowledge in most of African countries is transmitted through speech or orally. The region is quite rich in Indigenous knowledge, as can be attested by the high diversity of both cultures and the high diversity of genetic resources. In Africa, we have 45 to 50,000 species of plants. And it's estimated that about 5 to 8% of that diversity is actually edible. It's used in one way or another by the 22,100 communities in the continent. The two, genetic diversity and indigenous knowledge, of course, are linked together, quite closely linked. So in Kenya, we've been documenting both the genetic diversity of, particularly of plants, and also the indigenous knowledge which is associated with those plants. The government of Kenya, about 5 years ago, recognized the fact that we are losing indigenous knowledge, especially due to rural-urban migration. In 1970, rural-urban migration rural-urban migration stood at 8% in the country. And now cities have about 29% of the entire population of the country. And that's a big jump from 8% to nearly 30% at the moment. Most of the people are migrating from the rural areas to the urban cities, to urban centers, are mainly the youth under 35 years of age. And in Kenya, the youth constitute the largest, the majority of the population. The current status is right now is that the youth under 35 years of age, of course, plus adolescents and the children, constitute over 80% of the population, and that means when the youth migrate to cities, that they don't have the opportunity to gain experience from their environment, their rural environment, and also to get indigenous knowledge from the elderly, more knowledgeable people. And therefore, we've been losing knowledge, indigenous knowledge, particularly that is associated with the traditional food preparations and also identification of what is edible from the wild. From the work we have conducted over the years, we have noticed that 91%, for example, of all the vegetables that are consumed in the country are collected from the wild. It's only the remaining about 8-point-something or 9%, which is either cultivated or both cultivated and also available in the wild. So the greater majority of the diversity, and therefore the greater, the bulk of the knowledge, is associated with what is collected from the wild. And this is what led to the government allocating money for documentation work. Documentation work is now taking place throughout the country, but in stages. We started with 13 countries in phase 1, and the procedure is in each county. We have 47 counties altogether. In each county, the county identifies key stakeholders, especially community leaders in each community, and these are the community leadership. That's the community leadership that is registered with the government, and this is the leadership that gives authority for indigenous knowledge to be documented in their community. Documentation is normally, in our case, conducted or carried out by trained youth who are trained in basic skills of documentation, carrying out interviews, using the camera, video, still photography, audio recording, and then the use of questionnaires, which are in a special program in tablets. Recorded information, either in form of video, audio, and the questionnaires is all that is relayed to servers, which are at the county headquarters, and also at the national headquarters, which is the National Museums of Kenya, where I sit in a unit known as National Products Industry. Then so far, we've managed to document indigenous knowledge of 13 counties, and in each community, they do what they call prioritization of key assets, especially of traditional foods and medicine, key assets that to them are considered important and have potential for commercialization. And then an important point is the communities are taken through the process of access and benefit sharing, and also prior informed consent. In case anyone or any potential investor or even researchers would want to go and access that knowledge. This information is now relayed to servers within the National Museums of Kenya and also the counties. And on average, we are recording around 60 to 100 assets within a month. So far, as I said, we have done 13 counties, and we expect to do the rest in phases up to the last one, which is 47. This has been going well. And as I said, the information is accessible to anyone who has interest in any specific knowledge, for example, recipes of certain foods, but then they have to go through the laid down procedures, which are spelled very clearly in a law that was enacted in 2016, that reflects the Nagoya Protocol of 2010, and also the 1992 CBD Article 8J guidelines. This is expected to go on for years. We don't expect it to end very quickly, but it's a start. But we are happy that the government is committed to supporting the work until it's completed. I don't know how much time I have, Gina, for that, but that's basically what is happening in the country as far as the documentation of indigenous knowledge and traditional foods are concerned in the country.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick. And thank you for your tenacity to stick with this webinar format, even though you are out of power. Really, really great job. Thank you so much. As people might raise their hand now for a question, I see somebody, maybe somebody can raise their hand to ask their question that they put in the chat box. But I'd just like to say, I really think this example is very powerful for several reasons. One is it's the government of Kenya who's been sponsoring the research. And so that really shows the communities that this is a priority of the government, that the government's putting their own resources into it. And so I think that sends a very important and clear message, also to enable Patrick to work with the youth in these communities. The other thing, in addition to the government support, is Patrick's approach, which I've always really appreciated, which is to get the youth engaged. And so I think that this is really an amazing example of ways to get them engaged by using the camera, using photos, and documenting the community's traditional foods and knowledge. So I like that very much as well. And then the third thing that I think is really remarkable about this example is, as Patrick mentioned rather briefly, their attention to access and benefit sharing, and really retaining the knowledge of the community with the community. So the communities are the ones who will grant, if a researcher wants to know more about the species found in that community, they go through the process that was established, as Patrick mentioned, following guidelines set by the Nagoya Protocol and the Convention on Biological Diversity, to really give, the holders of the traditional knowledge the power to decide, who is going to get to use that knowledge. So it's such a rich example for very many reasons. I am now showing that I can't multitask very well. I don't see a hand up. So if there is a hand up, please raise it again. And now I'm scrolling through the questions.
Yeah, we have Mulele Sibeso going to ask.
Okay. Yeah, please, Mulele, ask your question.
Well, thank you so much. That was a lovely presentation. I was also quite encouraged to see that the Kenyan government took action by providing funds to do the documentation. And I was quite curious to hear from the presenter how they were able to convince the government to provide those funds, because I know that in most of our countries, I think access to funds is a key barrier to taking meaningful action especially when it comes to promoting indigenous food. Thank you.
Thanks. I guess that was just a comment.
I wanted to find out, was it easy for you to access the funds to carry out the documentation? How did you convince the government to provide those funds?
Okay, thanks. Thanks for your question. I think we laid bare the advantages and disadvantages of the advantages of documenting and the repercussions of not documenting. And of course, the advantages of documenting is a lot of these can be commercialized. And currently, the government is promoting what it calls the bottom-up approach, where things start from the communities and then up to the government. And this was a nice example of a bottom-up approach, where industrialization can easily start at the county level, depending on the strength of each community. Of course, each community has got its own strength depending on the resources it has, and that can easily spur rural economy. So that's how the government got convinced that this can work.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick. And thank you, Mulele, for that question. We'll move on now to our fourth and final speaker in the series, and that is Dr. Tesfaye Bekele. Dr. Bekele is with the Division of Human Nutrition and Health at Wageningen University and Research in the Netherlands, and he is going to speak on his work to advance healthier diets in Ethiopia through the study of the role of traditional and indigenous foods in Ethiopia's food systems. So I've seen a lot of people in the chat asking about Ethiopia and Ethiopians' traditional foods. And so I hope that this is inspiration for those of you who have asked about that. Over to you, Tesfaye.
Thank you, Gina, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for all of you. I would like to thank IUNS and also the Ag to Nutrition for inviting me and also for giving me the chance to share this new initiative on traditional and indigenous food. And this preliminary work is part of actually the new initiative of documenting traditional and indigenous food also in Ethiopia and also other countries in Africa, like in Ghana and also Zambia. So I will more focus today on this webinar on advancing healthier diet in Ethiopia. We are setting a methodology on developing indicator-based framework to analyze the role of traditional and also indigenous food in Ethiopia's food system. Maybe for people who don't know, I will just briefly mention about Ethiopia. Ethiopia is one of the largest population in Africa, the second largest next to Nigeria, and also the home of about 80 different ethnic groups live in Ethiopia. And each ethnic group have their own distinct traditional food and also what they call it quite indigenous food. And also Ethiopia is quite diverse in terms of agroecological zones. Whereas when we look at also the other side of Ethiopia, there are so many issues, especially when we come to diet or healthy diet, where we already know one like large proportion of the energy is coming from cereals, which is more even beyond the national dietary recommendation or the global recommendation. And there is also a very low consumption of nuts and seeds, and also very low consumption of fruits and vegetables, and quite low dietary diversity among different population group. And also the consumption of sugar sweetened beverage is also increasing over time. And there is also a very low intake of animal source food. So in terms of mitigating these different issues in the diet, I think the potential of traditional indigenous foods is quite high because these traditional indigenous food have quite good nutritive value, and they have also a potential to improve diet diversity, as well as improve the availability and also affordability of healthy diet, because most of the time the traditional indigenous foods are actually not giving a lot of attention in the national planning and also in people's daily diet in general. It's getting less and less attention. And also they have also potential on resilience to the local growing condition, because they have been there throughout many centuries. So they have this potential, and also they can have actually a potential to improve the agrobiodiversity in a way. Currently, globally, we are actually giving much more emphasis on very limited food products in terms of increasing the productivity of different food items across the different food groups. And also they have a potential to reduce deforestation. And there are different initiatives currently, also continental and also national green initiatives. They can have actually a potential to contribute for those initiatives if we're able to document them in a very systematic way and able to use them also in our research, in our future research across the different food system components. But the current challenge is there is overlooked or forgotten. These traditional foods are mostly they are overlooked or forgotten, and there is also a lack of a systematic evidence or lack of proper documentation of the traditional indigenous food. So because of that, we designed to develop a methodology for documentation. So we plan to build an indicator-based framework to compile data in a structured repository way and also analyze the role of traditional indigenous foods in Ethiopia's food system. So for this, first we try to list out all the different food system indicators. And then after that, we try to prioritize which of these food system indicators are actually relevant for the traditional and specific to the traditional indigenous food documentation. So for this, we used a different method like literature review and also database review. Plus, for the selection, we also used expert knowledge, so key informant interview of different experts in the food system area. Then we also try to search on the traditional and indigenous food. For this, we also set up a criteria. What is, when we say traditional and indigenous food, what do we mean by that, and what should be the criteria to consider the food item as a traditional or indigenous food. Then the third one is developing a framework or a tool that can be used to compile actually different data that could be from secondary data, like from published article or from databases, as well as also from the primary data collection. So for this, we set up a framework based on the selected indicators. And at the end, our aim is actually to promote the research in this, to understand the potential of the traditional indigenous food, and also identify the data gap based on the priority indicator, food system indicator selected for the traditional and indigenous foods. So this is the high level panel of expert food system framework, which we use to actually identify the food system indicators initially. Then once we identify these food system indicators, we listed them in different categories and subcategories. And we also defined each indicators, what does it mean? And then we put also the unit of measure for the indicators. And then we, after that, we ask experts if they think this each indicator is relevant for traditional indigenous food or not. So we also try to collect some of the reasoning why they think the indicators are relevant for the one they choose they are relevant. So for this work, for the indicator selection, initially we came up about 270 different indicators of the different domain of food system. And out of this, currently we able to choose around 124 indicators. As you see, those indicators are distributed across the different domains of the food system, like the external drivers and also the food supply chain, food environment, consumer behavior, also diet and dietary outcome, and other outcomes. So from this work, what we learn is there is an absence of dietary outcome indicators. This is because mostly actually dietary outcome indicators are measuring the complete diet or the combination of different diet, whereas we are actually trying to look for indicators on specific food items of the traditional and indigenous food. And the other thing is actually not all indicators are a single variable. So some are kind of index. So we need to further redefine and also look at the detailed variables within the each index. Still, we believe this 120 is quite a high number to go for, to start like compiling the evidence across the traditional indigenous food. So because of that, we decided now to move on and also further refine these 124 selected food system indicators with local experts in Ethiopia. So far we have been working with experts who are working more at global level. And the second part is on the selection of traditional indigenous food. This is mainly we just try to select as a preliminary work from literature and also database. Mainly we used also the Bioversity database and also different study papers conducted on traditional indigenous foods in Ethiopia. For this, we said these are some of the points we consider when we say a traditional indigenous food. So they have to be native or naturalized in the environment, and they can be also plant or animal source, and they have to be also part of the traditional recipe of the country, and also locally produced or accessed from the wild, and they can be also found in different setting. When we say setting, it could be agroecological setting, or it can be homemade or commercialized traditional foods. So for this review, actually, we only focused because of the extensiveness for the preliminary work, we focused only for the plant source. But in future, we want to also include the animal source, and also we want to go more further. This is more of a disk review. So from this disk review, we found about 117 like published article or also from the databases, but we still believe this is not the only one, and there is still a lot more. So we want to use a lot of local databases and also other ways, like, for example, collecting primary data from each ethnic groups, what they consider as a traditional food or indigenous food in every community or in every ethnicity in Ethiopia. Then at the end, our ultimate goal is actually to design the indicator-based framework or template that can be used actually to collect data on the selected or the priority traditional and indigenous foods that are available in Ethiopia, or also other countries when we move to the bigger research project, which we are hoping actually the research will initiate sometime this year. So from the preliminary work we did so far, our reflection is actually the indicator selection. Still, it requires further refinement, and also consulting or interviewing a local expert is more important also in this regard. And we are also aiming to actually expand this work, not necessarily only in Ethiopia, but also in Ghana and also Zambia, which we choose this actually because these two countries also, they developed quite recently their food-based dietary guideline, more close to the Ethiopia. So it will be quite interesting actually to share experience and also look this issue across different countries in Africa. Then after this process, we are also hoping to start collecting primary and also secondary data on the traditional and indigenous food. And then after that, we want to see the data gap and also promote more research on the traditional indigenous food. Also try to conduct more further research on traditional indigenous food in a way to promote healthy diet and also productivity, or they can be included in the national food system planning. So these are the potential collaborators. We are currently in contact with Wageningen University and also FAO, CGIAR, and also the Periodic Table of Food Initiative. Plus, there will be also more national institute that this will be included in this initiative this year. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tesfai. And thank you to all the speakers. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you very much to Harriet and Rebecca and Patrick and Tesfai for those fantastic presentations. If anybody has a specific question for Tesfai, please go ahead and raise your hand. And then we can take, just more questions of a general nature. We probably have some different resources that we can highlight to the group if there aren't specific questions. But if anyone has a question for Tesfai, please do raise your hand. And speakers, please turn on your videos. Okay, I would just like to say a few responses to, in general, the questions that were in the chat. A lot of people were asking, about how to find different resources. And I'd like to mention two projects, I think, that are providing resources. One is the Periodic Table of Food Initiative, which is set up to be able to enable the generation of food composition data using regional hubs. So it's not replicating what InFoods is doing, but it's adding a layer of additional analysis onto what's already generated in terms of food composition of the world's food biodiversity. And we do have centers of excellence in Africa. One is the Ethiopian Public Health Institute, and another is the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Ghana. We are also working with Mahidol University in Thailand and the University of the South Pacific in Fiji. So those regional hubs are tasked to generate additional food composition analysis. And we're working very closely on some of the issues that Patrick raised in his study, which I would love if Harriet or Barbara or anybody on the line want to also comment on that. But it's so important when working with Indigenous communities to get their free, prior, informed consent about using this knowledge and even documenting the knowledge in the form of open access food composition data. And then Patrick was the one speaker who mentioned using Nagoya Protocol and access and benefit sharing practices. Just to say, I'm not sure if it's going to come up. It might come up on the second or third webinar, but we're also at the Periodic Table of Food Initiative exploring working with local context, and they assign notifications and labels to data that's in their data set. And this is a good way of acknowledging the traditional knowledge as well as the community that holds the traditional knowledge and in some cases has been the steward of the seed systems to generate the fruit or vegetable or legume product, whatever it is that is being analyzed in terms of the food composition. So just to kind of say it's an evolving space and one that we're taking very seriously in terms of correct access and benefit sharing with local communities. And then the second thing, Anna can put in the chat her work that she's doing to document actual on the, linking the compositional information to what people are actually physically eating. And I think a few people asked about quality of diets, and this is what was pointed out also by Harriet, like what % of diets in these Indigenous communities came from traditional foods and what % came from more modernized foods. And so that's also part of the work of the Global Diet Quality Project, is to document actually what foods people are eating and look at the quality of diets as we're moving forward into this new space. Cecilia, if you would like to read out a question or two, if there is one from the audience. I see a lot of people asking. Please.
In the chat. Yeah, feel free to, well, I'll just ask the question from the chat. How do you deal with multiple varieties? Oh, that's from Harriet. How do you deal with multiple varieties for major species? For example, for maize or corn in North America alone, there are more than 1,500 varieties identified with samples in the Missouri Botanical Garden. So again, the question is, how do you deal with multiple varieties of major species?
Okay, yeah. So in terms of the project that I'm speaking about, the Periodic Table of Food Initiative, we have a whole series of variables that we're asking each of our data contributors to complete. And that gets the scientific name. We take a photo of the species, but we also ask specifically for the variety, cultivar, or breed, if that's known. And then that information is going to be in the database. So for example, we're looking at apples in the United States, and we're recording the variety of apple. We can have several different apple varieties, and they're known by their varietal name. Certainly the farmer who's growing them knows which variety they're naming. So I think some of it is just, having it be part of the questions that you're asking when you're gathering the food samples. And so we're always looking at getting that knowledge down to the variety, cultivar, breed level. And I know in some circumstances it's difficult, and that's why we also add photos. And I think Patrick and his methodology is doing the same thing. And I guess another thing is, working with experts, botanical experts and others who can help you identify that the cultivar variety or breed that you've documented, is substantiated from what they know by the shape of the leaf and shape of the fruit and where it's been grown. We document the latitude and longitude of the sample. So, Cecilia, is there another question that we want to get to? If not, I see a
Yes,
lot of
there is
comments.
one. Yeah, there is a question, I guess just asking for comments on the following concern. So general concern on the definition of traditional and indigenous foods. In an attempt to promote and commercialize these foods, the recipes and ingredients are being manipulated for mass production. For example, addition of sugar, colorants, and flavors to traditional fermented beverages which don't contain these foods. What, any comments from the panelists on this concern?
Maybe Harriet or Patrick, you could say a word. I know, Patrick, for sure, you've thought about the commercialization or, widespread, I guess, distribution of these foods that might have a very specific ecological niche. Harriet, I see you unmuted.
Well, I think you, first of all, have to decide what your objectives are for wanting to know this. Why do you want to know specifically the answer to that question? Going back to the question now to find.
I guess probably the concern is about ultra
Definitely.
processing or changing the nutrition of the food.
Well, I think that if it's a matter of changing the definition of or the composition of the food by commercializing it and adding other ingredients to it, then you have to think about labeling and all those kinds of things. But, the big political issue that comes up is what is indigenous and how can indigenous people actually identify what are their specific foods. So it's a problem.
Can I
Okay.
also?
Yes, Patrick, please.
Okay. Yeah. We've noticed that during documentation work, we have noticed that no recipes are exactly alike. As you move from region to region, even within the same community, you find there are small elements that make a recipe slightly different from the other. So that uniqueness is what matters when differentiating between one recipe and the other. And while commercializing, those unique elements are the ones you use to register a recipe as belonging to a specific person, a specific group, a specific clan, a specific household. And therefore, as you try to commercialize, that has to be documented in detail. That uniqueness has to be documented in details, so that it is clear that it belongs to you or that clan or that particular community. So yes, documentation is commercialization is feasible, but then anyone who is using that specific recipe has to enter into an agreement with the so-called owner or inventor of that particular recipe. If it's communal knowledge, then you have to get into an agreement with the community as a whole, and every community has its own representatives in form of registered group of elders, for example. And that's the one which gives you the go ahead to commercialize that particular recipe.
Great.
Of
Thank
course,
you, Patrick.
of course,
And thank
now
you,
you have to
Harriet.
enter.
Not
Sorry.
to cut you off, Patrick, but I know we're just slightly over time now, so I think we better wrap up. But I think those were very helpful final remarks on the importance, one, that this whole webinar was about the importance of systematic, standardized documentation using standard methods and tools that are co-created with others, and then also co-created with communities to generate the knowledge. But also, as Patrick was saying, is, it comes down to, appropriate acknowledgement of where this knowledge has come from and where these resources come from, and then working with communities if you are looking to, commercialize or make products from those resources.